Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. His new book is called Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So when you look back at this critical time in the Bush presidency during the Iraq invasion and the aftermath, is there evidence of Cheney's heart and how it affected him?
Well, he did lose energy, particularly toward the end of the presidency. His aides tell us that they began to alter his schedule, try to keep it a little lighter, made sure the people who went in to brief him were giving him shorter, more concise briefings. He was seen in the Oval Office from time to time kind of nodding off. President Bush would kind of make fun of him for that.
But I'm talking about the beginning of the Iraqi invasion, the time that he was under enormous stress as everybody else was.
There's no evidence that I heard, and I interviewed about 400 people for this book, that he was in some way incapacitated or somehow his judgment altered as a result of that. There is, always speculation about, did Cheney change because of his heart condition over the years? Was he more fervent in his beliefs as a result? I think that's probably overstated. I think he always was a strong conservative, always believed in the things that he pushed for in the early days of the Bush-Cheney White House.
There was this perception, of course, that Cheney was the one who was really pulling the levers of power of the Bush administration. What did you find? Well,
I find that the picture that we have of this presidency and vice presidency is too cartoonish. It's too stick figure, two-dimensional. It's a much more complicated story and a more interesting story. Very influential, certainly the most powerful vice president to his time, but it changed over time. By the time the Iraq invasion starts to go badly, by the time we get into the second term, President Bush begins to move in a different direction. He wants to do more diplomacy. He is less interested in attacking other countries.
In fact, you write that Bush and Cheney, by the time they left office, they were on opposite sides of almost every major issue, including North Korea, Syria, Lebanon, Russia, the Middle East peace talks, gun rights, gay rights, climate change, surveillance. They were very far apart at the end.
It's a big list, isn't it?
Exactly.
It is a big list. From Vice President Cheney's point of view, he felt that Bush had begun to move away from the principles that they had shared at the beginning, and he was very disappointed. From Bush's point of view, it was a course correction. He needed to begin to put his presidency on a line that would survive his time in office.
I just want to tick one through thing. One of the most consequential decisions, of course, of this presidency, and there were a lot in the Bush presidency, but certainly the decision to invade Iraq. And you go through a great deal about some of the doubts. Karen Hughes, one of the president's closest advisors, wanting to express those doubts and being sent to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And then you write this, you talk to a senior official who came to rue his involvement in Iraq, said, quote, "The only reason we went into Iraq, I tell people now, is we were looking for somebody's blank to kick. Afghanistan was too easy." What does that mean?
Well, I think he was talking about inside the administration and the country at large, that this was a period when, after 9/11, the country was in a very angry moment, a scared moment, and that it wasn't enough simply to go in and knock off these relatively primitive government in Afghanistan, and that Iraq became part of this. What do we do next? We have to keep going. And this particular official, unfortunately, is not named. He did come to regret it. A lot of people, I think, in the administration did come to regret it, and we see the results.
You write, too, in the book that personality tests show that Dick Cheney's ideal job would have been that as a funeral director.
He did tell that to President Bush, yeah. President Bush loved that. He thought that was a very funny line and an apt line, too.
And that in many ways, people thought that he actually engineered his way into the VP job. What do you mean?
Well, he, of course, ran the process that found a vice president. Strangely enough, turned out to be him. There's a lot of speculation about this. This is one of the great mysteries we'll have for a long time. His answer to that is, look, President Bush came to me early on through his aide, Joe Alba, and asked if I wanted to do it, and I said no. But there are people, even friends of his, who believe that, over time he found the flaws in all the other candidates so that he himself would be left in the position to be the logical choice.
But don't you suggest that Bush actually had talked about Cheney to be on his father's ticket?
That's the interesting thing, right?
Yeah, you learned that.
Bush had been actually focused on Cheney for a long time. He had suggested that his father dumped Dan Quayle in 1992, and who should he put on the ticket? Dick Cheney. So he jokes, in fact, I always had this idea of a Bush-Cheney for a long time.
Yeah. Let's talk about the president, George Bush, 43rd president of the United States. He comes off here, I think, better than many people expect him in terms of decision-making. Do you believe that?
Well, I think it's important to try to get into the decision making, to understand why he made the decisions he did, not to agree with them or disagree with them, but
Right.
in order to evaluate how they were made. And I think that history is going to re-examine and re-look at this period of time for decades. We're going to be debating these things for a long time.
Yeah, because you say that he left office, though, as the most disliked president in 7 decades.
He did.
So, and Cheney didn't fare much better than that either.
No, he didn't. In fact, a former aide goes to President Bush after office and says, what's it like to leave office as such an unpopular president? And he kind of bristles. He says, I was also the most popular president, which he was for a time after 9/11.
Why wouldn't President Bush talk to you?
President Bush didn't believe that a book written by a New York Times reporter could be fair. He felt that the paper had not been balanced in his time in office. But I think in the end he allowed a lot of people around him to talk, at least implicitly.
And then quickly, you have an interesting nugget, too, about Harriet Miers. People may not remember that name, but she was actually going to be President Bush's choice to the Supreme Court. And then they tested her, and she knew very little about the Constitution.
Yeah, they had the lawyers go and try to prep her for the Senate hearings, right? You have to go before the Senate and answer a lot of questions. They found she really didn't have the mastery of things like Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, Fifth Amendment, self-incrimination. You know, she had been a Dallas lawyer, very talented, very accomplished, but these are not issues she had been schooled on, and she would have been crucified, they felt, in a Senate hearing.
And Cheney said, I tried to tell him.
I tried to tell him, yeah.
Peter Baker, thank you. Great book.
Thank you.